Here I have two 61 key MIDI controllers, both from Arturia. Both are Keylabs. The difference being one is a Keylab MKII, being the black one right here, and the other is a Keylab Essential. And that would be the white keyboard right here. I think the main difference that you guys are going to notice right off the bat is the fact that the Keylab 61 MKII actually has more pads and more buttons than the Keylab 61 Essential. Surprisingly though, they both have the same amount of encoders and sliders. However, one thing that I like more about the MKII sliders, these travel a lot further than the sliders on the Essential. So on the Essential, you only get this much movement. On the MKII, you get a whole lot more travel, and that allows for more precision and accuracy as you're traveling through the fader settings. The quality of the endless encoders and the faders are exactly the same, but underneath the faders of the MKII, there are buttons that you have access to access different sounds and, say for example, Analog Lab. Those are missing on the Essential. I know inside of Ableton, those also help with track selection. I'll definitely do a tutorial on the MKII and Ableton here in the future. I'll probably do one for the Essential as well. The other thing that might catch your eye right off the bat are the pitch and mod wheels. And that pretty much tells the story of the actual build quality of both of these keyboards. You'll notice that these are plastic, these are metallic, and that goes for the entire chassis of the MKII. While the Keylab Essential is plastic, the Keylab MKII is metal. But that being said, you'll definitely notice a difference in weight. So the Keylab Essential is super lightweight. Holding this up with one hand is no problem. So this is something more built for travel. And because of the price, I feel a lot better moving this around. The Keylab is almost twice the price and definitely twice the weight or more. I don't feel comfortable holding this with one hand, that's for sure. Now, the most important thing about build quality are the keys and probably the pads. In terms of the responsiveness of the pads, they feel exactly the same. Really, the only difference between the pads are that these are square and these are more rectangular. Some advice that I have for playing the pads, let me load up a kick. So here I have a kick loaded up. If you want to play the pads really fast, I suggest playing the pads on the corners versus in the middle. So in the if you play the pad directly in the middle of the pad, you're going to hit a lot of dead space, if that makes sense. It might be easier to just show you what I'm talking about, so I'm going to try and play this kick as fast as I can. Actually, let me load up a hi-hat. So if you're trying to rapidly toggle between two pads, you hear how I'm missing the pads sometimes? And that's me playing right in the middle of the pad. So to avoid that, I actually suggest playing on the corners of the pad, or on the edges of the pad, and that way you'll actually trigger the sound every time. Every single time I hit it. Versus trying to hit it directly in the middle. You can hear that I'm somehow missing the trigger. Same deal on the Essential. But if I go on the corners, it's effective every time. Also keep in mind that you heard a velocity difference because I have the Essential set to full velocity, and on the Keylab MKII, I have that set to just normal velocity. So it scales up from 0 to 127. I'll also link in the description below my Arturia Keylab Essential and Arturia Keylab MKII videos. Both of those videos go in depth on how to manipulate the different settings with the Arturia MIDI Control Center. And now for the biggest difference between these two keyboards in terms of actually playing the keyboard, it's the keybed. When I first got the Keylab Essential, I was actually pleasantly surprised with how good the keybed is. Right now I'm going to load up Analog Lab and we're going to listen to what this keybed sounds like with my playing. And let's take a listen. And now let's take a listen to the MKII. So overall, you shouldn't hear too much of a difference between me playing the MK2 or the Essential on the same preset, at least when it comes to pianos. If anything, you might have heard that I had slightly more control over the variation of velocity on the MK2, and that's something that you'll definitely feel. So even though you didn't hear much of a difference, I'll tell you right now, there's a huge difference in the feeling of playing. I'm totally comfortable playing with this keyboard. I would even say that out of all of the other keyboards in this price range, this is probably the best Keybed. However, the MK2 is using the Keybed from the Arturia Mini Brute, so it's actually using the premium Keybed from one of its synthesizers. Me personally, I'm always looking for more of a synth action Keybed versus a hammer action Keybed. Reason being, I play a lot more synths and virtual instruments versus just straight pianos. And because I grew up using synths and workstations, I've gotten really used to playing pianos on synth Keybeds. My favorite Keybed of all time is on the Roland Phantom, and that uses a FTAR Keybed. If any of you out there are familiar with FTAR Keybeds, in my personal opinion, those are the best Keybeds that were ever made and are probably ever going to be made. Out of all of the Keybeds that I've ever played since then, this is the closest that I've ever felt to that. It's not the same, but the feel of the action is very smooth. There isn't too much resistance, there's not too little resistance, and the travel of the keys is really nice in terms of how far you can go down on the keys. So they did a lot of things right with this Keybed. But now I'm going to show you a huge difference between these two Keybeds and why I personally would never choose the Essential over the MK2. So here's the biggest difference between the Keylab Essential and the Keylab MK2 in my personal opinion, and that's aftertouch. Here I have a pad loaded up in Analog Lab, and let's just listen to the difference between this same preset on both of these keyboards. That was the Keylab Essential, and here's the Keylab MK2. So the main difference that you're hearing, if I press down on the key harder, the sound opened up the cutoff envelope and the sound became brighter. So that type of modulation can give you an extra depth of articulation or dynamics with your synthesizers. I personally have never owned a keyboard that didn't have aftertouch besides this Keylab Essential, and I'll tell you that I definitely missed it. It's one of those things where if you've had it before, you definitely miss it once it's gone. So I'm really happy to have this MK2 in my workflow for the aftertouch. On top of that, I would say that the Keylab MK2's aftertouch is actually the best aftertouch that I've ever had on a keyboard. For whatever reason, the previous keyboards that I had from Roland and Adderall, their aftertouch was really finicky in terms of being able to trigger it. It seemed like you almost had to break the keyboard in order to trigger the aftertouch, even after messing around with the dynamic settings of the aftertouch. One upgrade that I would like to see to the MK2 is a polyphonic aftertouch. That's actually what the CS80 was originally. It was a polyphonic aftertouch synthesizer. It would be awesome to have that capability with our own MIDI controller and be able to implement that with any plugin. That way, each individual key can open up a filter or close a filter or create its own modulation rather than modulating the entire sound. That would make a whole nother level of expressiveness in playing. That being said, I do plan on buying an MPE controller, which is MIDI Performance Expression, I believe. I think that's what that stands for. Arturia makes a plugin called Pigments, which actually interacts with controllers like that, and that would give me multiple levels beyond the expression of even just aftertouch. But that's for another video. The last couple differences between the two keyboards are the chord memory function and the actual hardware options on the back. On the Keylab Essential, you can hold on to the chord button and press a chord. And now that chord is saved, and no matter what key you press, it will play that chord starting with that key with the root note. It's nothing that I would ever use, but it's there. You could do the same thing with the Keylab MK2, but they added another function called Chord Memory. In chord memory mode, it has a bunch of chords saved here for you. You could hold the chord button and create your own chord for each pad. Click on the pad that you want to change, and then press whatever chord you want to play. And now that pad will become that chord. Then you have chord transpose mode, and to use this, all you have to do is just hit chord, and now whatever chord you play will be transposed. And then finally, the other big difference between these two keyboards is the fact that the MK2 can actually connect with other keyboards and synthesizers through the CV connections on the back. The MK2 only has MIDI out, a sustain pedal, and then the USB and DC in. Meanwhile, the MK2 has additional expression pedals and even an on-off switch, which definitely comes in handy because I personally have my keyboard in my bedroom and I don't necessarily like the laser light show at night, so I like to turn that off. Both of these keyboards come loaded with software, specifically Analog Lab, so you'll be able to get started right off the bat. Once again, I'll link both videos for my Arturia Keylab MKII video and my Arturia Keylab Essential video, where you can learn how to auto-map everything inside of FL Studio to your V collection. And stay tuned for a future video where I show you how to auto-map any MIDI controller to any plugin or DAW setting inside of FL Studio. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.